Today, I want to talk about ways that we can introduce agent-based modeling approaches to the next generation of climate models known as Earth systems models, with the goal being to understand in particular how land use and land cover change serves as a nexus of human-environment interaction. So first, some background. A lot of people have a pretty intuitive understanding of how weather and the climate system impacts the land surface, in particular agricultural land. So if there's not enough water, we have the risk of droughts and crop failure. But if there's too much water, we can have massive landscape change or destruction of hard human-made infrastructure. And likewise, we have an intuitive understanding of how people both extract resources from agricultural land surfaces and also shape them in some way. So the most obvious examples being clear-cutting of forests to expand agricultural land and of irrigating the desert to also expand agriculture into dryland environments. But we have a less intuitive understanding of how to close this feedback loop. That is, how do the changes that we make to the land surface through things like deforestation and irrigation feed back in to alter the climate and weather systems in ways that is meaningful to us? And so this really highlights the role of land use and land cover change as a nexus of human environmental interactions, in particular because the ways that we change the land surface affect biogeophysical cycles. So that's the flow of water and energy between the land and atmosphere. And so these land atmospheric feedbacks are really key for understanding human impacts. So Earth systems models are really the best tools that we have available today to understand how land use impacts these biogeophysical cycles. So an Earth systems model is kind of the next generation of climate model. Your typical climate model basically looks at the flow of water and air in the ocean and atmosphere and looks at fluid dynamic equations and conservation of energy and mass momentum to answer these questions. An Earth systems model basically adds in the biosphere. So we have a more enhanced representations of vegetation and how those interact with the climate cycle. Also algae in the oceans, the effects of dust and aerosols in the atmosphere, fires, and a lot more kind of more complex processes that really matter beyond just the simple circulation of air and water in our atmosphere and our oceans. And so Earth systems models are a really key tool for looking at how land use and land cover change impacts the climate. And the key part of these models are the land surface submodules. So these are modules that specifically look at the land surface and how that influences flows into the climate. And so you can see here an example from the community land model, all the different kinds of flows it represents. You have all these surface energy fluxes, you have flows of water through the hydro system, and you have biogeochemical cycles, so flows of carbon and nitrogen between the land and the atmosphere. And so these are all represented in different ways in the land surface model. And these models are already designed to account for human impact. So as long as you give them time series maps of where people are cutting down trees, where are they irrigating, where are they planting land for agriculture, these models are able to capture how they alter the flows between the land and the atmosphere. So what we need to do today is talk about how can we add in social complexity? How can we generate these time series of land use and land cover change in such a way that actually fits with our understanding of how culture works as a complex adaptive system? And so agent-based modeling really emerges as the obvious choice here. We realize that that land use is the function of agents interacting in time and space with limited information, limited resources, and the long-term results and impact on the climate system really need to be traced down to that basic agent level. So as an example of a case where we want to be able to have an Earth systems model and an agent-based model interacting is Roman North Africa. So this is an area that a priori we know has very tight coupling between the land and atmosphere. During the mid-Holocene, with more or less similar orbital conditions to today, there's a rapid transition between vegetated savanna and dry desert that was almost entirely a function of local feedbacks between trees and the atmosphere. So keeping precipitation constant over the desert, we had a rapid switch in ecosystems. And so we also know that during the Roman imperial period, there's massive land use and land cover change, expansion of agricultural land at the expense of forests in the north, an expansion of olive plantations with irrigation in the south and the desert regions. And that was both a function of internal social factors and exogenous pressures from the Roman Empire. And so to understand how this entire system works in a coupled manner, we really need an agent-based approach that leverages Earth systems models in some way. So now I want to talk about some practical aspects to integrating agent-based modeling and Earth systems modeling. So first, the obvious is that the Earth systems models do much of the heavy lifting for us. As long as we can generate maps that can be input into an Earth systems model, the ESMs will do much of the heavy lifting in terms of calculating the changes in the fluxes to land and atmosphere, and then how those changes in the atmosphere get propagated throughout the system through atmospheric circulation. So we need our agent-based models that first, obviously, take Earth systems models outputs as inputs. So these can be really simple things such as precipitation and temperature, so weather from the model. We can also get more complex. You can get in wind direction intensity data, or you could do something like have the rate at which irrigation infrastructure degrades in your agent-based model be a function of the storminess represented in the Earth systems model. You can also use these land surface models to calculate crop yields. They have embedded crop models that are tightly coupled to the representations of what's also going on in the atmosphere and land. And so you can use that information to calculate what's the maximum potential yield for a given area, and then have your agent-based model use a yield reduction factor to see how, for example, how does changes in labor inputs from your ABM affect crop yields. You can also use ESMs to generate realistic initial conditions. So initialize your agent-based model with vegetation and water distributions across the landscape that are at equilibrium with the climate system. And so this leads to much cleaner modeling efforts. And also, obviously, we need to have an agent-based model that outputs maps that can be read into a land surface model. So for the community land model that I discussed earlier, it uses basically these 4 different types of inputs. So where is agriculture and pasture land on the landscape? Where are people harvesting wood and at what intensity? Where are people on the landscape, and where is their land that's equipped for irrigation? So if you're able to generate those kinds of maps in an agent-based model, all you have to do is input them into these land surface subcomponents of the Earth systems models, and they will do the rest of the work for you. Next, I want to talk about some more subtle design principles that you can incorporate into your agent-based models that you may be working on now in order to ensure that there'll be a more tighter, holistic coupling with your systems models. So the first is kind of obvious for agent-based modelers, is that we want the nexus of land use decision-making being at the agent level. We want boundedly rational households on choosing where to plant what. We don't want deterministic functions of population density or land suitability. And that's really what the state of the art is now. So if you're looking at paleo studies using Earth systems models, they use these retrodictions based on present-day population distributions, and they push them back into the past with some kind of deterministic function looking at what's the land use per capita, and then estimating based on static factors such as slope, where is there good agricultural land, and then allocating that land accordingly. And so this is really deterministic. We have no dynamics, so the land use can't really change very well in time in response to the climate system. And also, as you can see from these 2 different reconstructions of the same exact time period, they can wildly differ based on some basic assumptions you make about per capita land use. And so the alternative then is to move the level of decision-making from the population level, but down to the agent level. So we want agents that sense their environment some way, they sense their crop yields, make a labor time allocation decision. How much do I want to plant? Where do I want to plant it? How much agriculture do I want to do? How much pasture land do I want to keep? All those things happen at the agent level. And then that then feeds back into the land surface, which again, in the next time step is going to be looked at by the agents to make different decisions. And so this approach, bringing the decision-making down a level, allows us to capture the impact of heterogeneous agents with different information, different goals, resources, and the more detailed trade-offs between different land use types. And so we can still think about agricultural suitability, so like low slope lands being more favorable, but still the decision-making nexus is at the level of the individual rather than looking at some broad-scale population level function. We also, another design principle we can incorporate our agent-based models are using plant functional types instead of biomes or land cover classes to characterize vegetation in our models. So PFTs are basically classes of plants that are more or less similar. So you can think of a grass as a plant functional type, or a deciduous tree as a plant functional type, or a temperate broadleaf tree as a plant functional type. And so what the land surface models do is they represent the land surface as combinations of these components. So instead of treating, say, a savanna as a discrete land cover type with a fixed biomass that your agents can go harvest, a land surface model would treat a savanna as a place that has, say, 20% coverage of deciduous trees and 80% coverage of C2 grasses. And so by combining that in such a way, you have a much more nuanced look at what is actually going on in the environment in terms of vegetation and how does that affect that flows between the land surface and the atmosphere. And so not only will having an agent-based model that looks at PFTs rather than biomes make it easier to couple it to an Earth systems model, but it also makes it easier to look at the actual paleo data that we have available as archaeologists. So most of the time when you look at pollen-based reconstructions of biomes in the past, they're actually under the hood looking at plant functional types, looking at what pollen taxa belong to which plant functional types, and then estimating what the biomes are as some emergent property of combinations of different plant functional types. And so by looking at PFTs from the beginning in our agent-based models, we get much closer to what's going on in the actual reconstructions we're using. And so the final tip I have is to use a hierarchical modeling framework to route large-scale population and trade flows. So the issue is that if we have individual agents making land use decisions, if we want to have this model working on a region of any useful size, this is going to become really computationally intractable. And so land surface models actually have a similar problem that they deal with through a hierarchical modeling approach. So land surface models that they're the flows of water and energy with the land and atmosphere are going to be different based on the cover of the land. So different kinds of crops, irrigated or non-irrigated crops, different kinds of vegetation, different building materials, all will have different relationships with the atmosphere. And what these kinds of models do is they calculate all of those different relationships, separately, and then combine them. So a single grid cell can have an arbitrarily complex tiling of different land cover types, but all that the atmosphere sees is a single area weighted flow that's averaged together from all these different land types. And so this is much computationally more tractable, because then you can parallelize all of these different tiles and then have your atmospheric model work with them together. And so we can take a similar approach to agent-based modeling of land use. So we can have individual watersheds be the scale that we look at agent-level decision-making with very fine spatial resolution. And then if we want to look at flows of people and resources between different watersheds, we can look at, say, a city road network like here and use some kind of spatial interaction model to route these flows. And so this is basically a computational savings, and it's acknowledging that the real nexus of where agents are bumping into each other and interacting is at the watershed level. And then at the level beyond these watersheds, we can better understand these flows as they're constrained by where cities and roads are in the landscape. So just to summarize quickly, Earth systems models provide a physically consistent representation of climate using scientifically validated models with well-engineered software components. So rather than, as an agent-based modeler, having to use your own different crop model with a separate weather model, with a separate river runoff model, and hoping that they all work together well, you can use these scientifically validated components that have been put together, that have been purpose-built to work together. So you know that the crop model you're using is going to work well with the weather model that you're using, because they're all part of the same large modeling framework. And likewise, agent-based models allow us to generate land use maps from the bottom up in ways that can both contribute and adapt to environmental variability. And so together, these two modeling approaches can really help us close this feedback loop and better understand how humans and the environment interact through the medium of the land surface. Thank you.